Hey everybody, it's Bust with our Legends of Runeterra patch note review for the 4.2.0 patch, the 420 patch if you will. And so, lots going on with this patch. Big changes happening to the cards, big changes happening to the formats. I'm excited about all of it. And before we jump in and talk about it, I did want to make note that I do really love this incoming sequence of patches, given how expansive we've seen them be between the balance patch and now the first variety patch of the game. One of my kind of historic problems as being an old man boomer, remembering back in the days of playing Magic, is to where the sets came out every 3 months. And so right when the set came out, that would be exciting. You would get a bunch of drafts in and go to pre-releases and play some fun and exciting upcoming Friday Night Magics, but then, like second and third month into the set, it would really kind of dull down and be kind of boring. And so, at least with Magic, you had a little bit of variety, just in there being so many formats that you could kind of dodge and weave and pick and choose between playing like modern and standard and legacy or whatever else is running around out there. But if you were just a standard grinder, it was a kind of tough space for me just because it got so boring. Like after you've played a set for 6 weeks straight, it just loses a bit of its luster. And so that was always kind of problematic. And then it kind of expounded itself in Hearthstone. I haven't played Hearthstone in 3 or 4 years. It might be different at this point, but one of the problems I always had with Hearthstone was the new cards came out, that would be great. You would grind up to Masters or Legend, whatever it is, and play a ton of it. The next month would roll around, you would get up there, but once you got there, you weren't that excited about it. And then if there weren't any further balance patches, if you were outside of that space to where you were really grinding hard to be up at the top of the ladder, you basically just hit Masters and quit. And so that's nothing you really want to see happen within the ecosystem of your card game. You never want people to be like, I'm just going to play it for a couple days and just quit, right? That's always a bit of a disaster. And so I think that these balance patches are fantastic. The game is going to drastically change here in the next few hours as the patch notes come out. And I love the way that this really keeps everything fresh without being like a big monetary investment in a new set. Pretty exciting stuff. And so, the way I want to take the rest of this video, I thought that this was just going to be a change to like 5 or 10 cards. We'd be out of here in 10 minutes or so, but there's quite a bit to talk about within this patch note set. And so, I'm going to talk about the competitive section first. And then if you want to listen to my poor evaluations of the cards, or if you want to see a specific card, it should be a little bit easier to skip to if you're at that place of the video. And so to jump into the competitive section, the daily rumbles, they are now going to be starting, well, I should say at March 10th. They'll be starting at 10 a.m. server time. And I love seeing this change. I feel like the 4 p.m. server time was a bit of a mess. I get why they probably did it. They didn't want you to jump into like 3 and 4 and 5 minute queues depending on the amount of people out and about playing in the rumbles. But for me, it was really challenging to jump into. As an old man boomer, I tend to go to bed at 9 p.m. at night. And with this thing starting at 6 p.m., once you get done with dinner and chilling out a little bit, I just didn't have too much time to play in these. And then if you're out there as one of these youngsters, a nice high school or college kid running around, I could definitely see you having jobs in the evening, just not being able to play in these things whatsoever. It was kind of a bummer. And so seeing it move to 10 a.m. server time, I feel like really opens it up for everyone. I hope that the matchmaking and everything goes as smoothly as hoped. With this expanded amount of time. My solution was to just kind of stagger it. And so maybe one day of the week it starts at 10, one day it starts at 12, one day it starts at 2 or something. But that may be too much to manage schedule-wise and programming-wise. And so at least having this entire window open like this, I'm pretty excited to see it happen like that. Up next with piece number 2, the next Runeterra Open is March 18th through the 20th. I was a little confused by this one. I thought that the next Runeterra Open was one of the kind of like seasonals like events to where you would play in day 1 and then day 1, depending on how you did, would lead into a day 2 kind of thing. Looks like that's not the case with this one. This is just going to be the kind of expanded Gauntlet Runeterra Open. And so pretty excited about that as well. And then down here, they do make mention of some new formats. And so they'll be starting with a 30 hit point Nexus format and then a Singleton format as well. And so I'm not entirely certain how I feel about all of the daily rumbles and the formats swapping around and everything. I do think it's nice that it's not just best of 3 all the time. But my kind of hope and desire is that there is like kind of predominantly best of 3. And so I was, my kind of hope and dream for the format is that it would follow kind of a cycle as to where 1 week you would have best of 3, next week you would have something weird like 30 health, then the next week it would be best of 3, as these things kind of tie in to those Runeterra Open tournaments. My problem with seasonals in the past is there was no real way to grind out best of 3 leading up to a seasonals event. And so the gauntlets cut off like 4 or 5 days before seasonals came. You didn't have any real way to play that current format. And so without having them kind of tied together, it was a bit of a mess. And so now it may be a bit of a kind of overcorrection, in my opinion, in the sense that if there's 5 and 6 of these different formats running around, they don't really tie into the Runeterra Opens that well, and so it'll be kind of tough to see how these get juggled around and how the formats go. And so I'm not completely upset. I don't have a giant problem with this. I would love it if Runeterra just got big enough to where they could always keep best of 3 open and then cycle these other things, but as these beta events kind of turn out and things get kind of streamlined and such, I'm curious to see how it goes. That was just my big one, though, as the format leading up to a Runeterra Open or to a Seasonals should be the same format that event is going to be. It sounds like that's their plan, but I kind of like the idea of really driving home the standard format. And so you have a bit of kind of cohesiveness between the ladder and the best of 3 events and such. But at the end of the day, I think everything there is going smoothly. Now, last but not least, there is a big note in here for the final Singleton patch. I can't tell if Riot, or I should say for the final Runeterra Open of the beta season, I can't tell if they're just memeing or if this is what it actually is, but it does say that Singleton is going to be the format for the Runeterra Open. That would be the one coming up in March. They wanted to try and experiment with a different format for the last Runeterra Open of the beta season, and then once it's gone, it should be switching into the competitive formats. They like that. If that was the note on its own, then sure, whatever. But then it does have the editor's note of "Ruben, don't steal my job," and so I'm not entirely certain if this upcoming one is actually going to be Singleton. It wouldn't surprise me if it was. Because if you want to kind of stop and think about how these are supposed to go, they do make mention that, I should say Riot makes mention that they are going to have the legacy-based format be a piece of the Runeterra Opens. They didn't specify how frequently or how that was going to entirely play out, but if they do need to load a format that isn't standard into the Gauntlet, just as a testing means before the real ones come around, then sure, have it be Singleton, I guess. And so that does, from the sense of kind of testing the game and testing the format and everything, make a little bit of sense. But it does strike me as strange seeing Singleton be the choice in there, not having it be best of 1 or best of 3, or not having it be best of 1 or best of 3 standard and having it be best of 1 Singleton. And so kind of an interesting space, at least should make the event go much faster, right? We were looking at the previous one playing 9 rounds, having to play 2.5 games in each round. That got you up to 20-some games that you're going to be playing. If you're playing 10-minute games on average, that was like 200 minutes. And so it could have realistically taken 3 or 4 hours to get through, which I don't think is that big of a deal, but people going to complain, and that was one of the big complaints running around. So getting in 12 matches shouldn't be, or 12 best of 1, or 9 best of 1 games shouldn't be that big of a deal for anyone looking to jump into that competitive space. And so with those out of the way, we can jump into the cards. And I think this is a pretty interesting thing. I'm trying to think of how some of these cards come to existence. If this is just either the direction that the game is taking and this is the power level that the cards are going to be, or if this is just kind of like the precursor to the rotation. And I think that's kind of interesting way to look at these, as we're going to say come up to the Demacia card that's just way better than Loyal Badger Bears. I'm curious if that's either Riot, preparing for the power level they expect certain things to be at in the upcoming game as cards cycle out, or if this is just the new space. This is where things are going to kind of be, and it's interesting to me given that. One of the things I don't feel like Riot has really touched on a lot is what your factions are supposed to be good at. And I feel like a lot of these cards really drive home what your faction is supposed to be good at. And so it's like if you look at Magic and you talk about the color pie and you want to say, how do I remove a creature? And so you say, okay, well, red is able to have cards that deal direct damage. So Lightning Bolt deals 3 damage to a unit. That's how they do it. Black tends to have just remove anything kind of spells like Murder or Terror that says, boom, your unit's just dead. Green tends to not be able to remove units, right? Green is kind of the nature-y color that doesn't want their units to grow away, but they're able to kind of like trap stuff in a spider web, and so you might be able to capture or destroy a flying unit that flies into your web or whatever. Blue can send units back to the hand, and white doesn't do removal well either, but they tend to be able to kind of have combat-focused removal. So if your opposing unit is tapped, you can kill it. If the opposing unit is attacked or blocking, you can kill it, but it's not anything that basically just says, get this thing out of here right away. And it's kind of tough with a lot of the aspects of Runeterra and a lot of the factions to say, what these factions are particularly good at, especially when it comes to something like removal or something like combat tricks. I feel like there's a lot of overlap between where a lot of the factions sit, and we are going to see a bit of that, right? Given that there's, I don't know, like 10 factions in the game. we should probably know how many there are at this point, but I think there's 9, 10, whatever, and you can see like little bits and pieces of it, right? You can see that Demacia is good at starting fights. Noxus is kind of good at starting fights, but it also has some kind of damage-based stuff. Shadow Isles tends to have the direct removal spells, but then you start to see things like Pokey Stick. And it's just, there's no, like, I feel like, real delineation in any of these effects. I think you could look at a card like Pokey Stick, and then if you put it into P and Z, you'd say, yeah, that makes sense. That belongs there. But if you put a card like Pokey Stick into Noxus, it shouldn't make sense, right? And so I think that there probably should be some overlap in the factions, but I don't feel like the full-on application of a color pie has really been kind of laid out or discovered. And so the game is still pretty far into its infancy. I'm sure it has a lot of time to grow into that kind of thing as more cards are released and the factions really kind of find their homes. But I feel like this patch itself is really kind of trying to drive home some of those color pie themes to where some of the factions are really kind of pulling out where their stake in the mechanics are. Okay, and so up first, we have the Ceaseless Sentry. And first and foremost, he kind of ties into that idea we were just talking about as to kind of repositioning the color pie, if you will, right? The Last Breath draw card doesn't feel super Freylordy. It may have been the intent back with the release of the game, but now that we are 2-3 years into it, it doesn't really feel like a fit. It seems like Freylord does get some card draw, tends to be kind of limited to units and kind of specific in that sense. So there's cards like Shared Spoils that boost your units and you draw a card. There's cards like Revna that boosts your deck, you draw a card. There's some limited stuff like the thing that draws Yetis or Poros or Elniks. It doesn't feel like Freylord just gets draw a card, as to where that is something that Shadow Isles does get. You see it on things like Grips Beyond and Spirit Leech. They have a lot of kind of the card draw aspects tied in. And so this is the kind of thing as to where I'm curious if a lot of these cards, based on some of the future ones, their power level, but here, as we see these like kind of retoolings like the Ceaseless Sentry, if this is the kind of preview patch into rotation. And so if we're going to see a card like Avarosian Sentry removed from standard, not for power level by any stretch of the word, but in the sense that it doesn't really feel very Freylordy anymore. And so I'm kind of curious how Riot takes a lot of these cards. We'll kind of keep this idea in our mind through some of the rest of the discussion here, because I think that that's what's about to happen. I think Avarosian Sentry is about to get removed out of Standard, and then the Ceaseless Sentry is the kind of functional replacement in the faction that it belongs. And so, in terms of the Ceaseless Sentry itself, it's a fine card. I don't get excited about this because we don't like to play cards like this, but I think that in the kind of control deck era of the world, people might like it. In the decks that I've kind of found to play things like Slayers, probably don't. It's something that, in terms of the Slayers deck, you were always more interested in just generating units and having dudes on the board that you could cast your Slays onto. And you weren't quite worried as much about generating value out of those Slays. And so I think he may end up finding a home, but the Slayers decks I don't think really want it. But on the flip side of that, when you start to think of the new hotness coming out of the game in terms of Soul Cleave, I always refer to Soul Cleave as having the and factor. This was a concept that we kind of came up with in Expedition as to where you aren't really looking to just play a card for directly what it does. It needs a little bit of and factor to it. And so if you're looking towards, say, like the Reforge deck with Riven, you didn't want to just be fully focused in on Reforge. You wanted to do Reforge and something. And so you wanted to do Reforge and Augment. You wanted to do Reforge and Taric. You wanted to do Reforge and discard stuff. You weren't just doing Reforge. You had a little bit of and factor to it. And that's what I always kind of tie Soul Cleave to. With Soul Cleave, it needs a little bit of something else. If all you're doing is Soul Cleaving a Ceaseless Sentry, that's not enough. Just playing Soul Cleave to draw a bunch of cards isn't quite good enough. But if the kind of and factor to it is that that's your backup plan, then maybe it's not nearly as bad. And so we'll see how these things go. I don't get excited about Ceaseless Sentry, but I think from the design perspective is where a lot more interesting stuff happens with the Sentry as opposed to what the card can do in Standard itself. Up next, we have the Generous Gemcrafter. I don't think this one's going to see play. I immediately start to think of Varus and the Cultists and the double cast spells as getting a little bit of usage out of this, but the stat line on the unit is just too small. If this was a 2/2 for 2, then maybe, but being a 2 attack, 3 drop, or not having a 4th point of health really kind of knocks this unit out of contention. And so I don't think that this one's going to catch any realistic or reasonable play, but it is a very kind of powerful ability to have to consider when you think of playing things like Pantheon Taric, or not Pantheon Taric, Pantheon Varus, and having access to all of those double spells. And so I guess the next kind of thing you could look at is just say playing Lee Sin. I guess there's always something, right? If you look to give Lee Sin the bonus stats to get the OTK with him, the Generous Gemcrafter can tie into that. But these all strike me as strategies that are just win more and not enough to help you actually win the game. So up next, we have the Blocking Badger Bear. Very interesting card. If you remember back in the day, at its initial release, Loyal Badger Bear was a 4/4 for 3, and that was deemed to be too good. And now we get to see the Blocking Badger Bear, which is the 4/4 for 3 that has the elite tag and can also block elusives. And so I'm very interested seeing that coming out. If this is just where the power level of these cards should be, or if there's something a little bit more at play here. And again, tying back to that kind of color pie idea, I think the card like this is fine. It's one of those things as to what is Demacia good at? It's good at putting big vanilla units on the board and fighting. And those are things that the Badger Bear should be able to do. Would a card like this ever fit in, say, P and Z? Like, no, P and Z should have shitty units. Bilgewater should have shitty units. Things like Demacia should have these kind of big vanilla-y kind of bruisers, if you will. And so it feels like Demacia is kind of tied into that green aspect of Magic, if you will, to where they have a lot of big vanilla units that like to fight each other. And so I think that it's kind of okay to see this come into the space. I'm surprised to see it hit with all of these keywords and everything, but I think Demacia does need to kind of like stake its claim as to what it's good at. And if every card in the game is a 3/3 for 3, then Demacia doesn't really get to stake its claim anywhere in there. And so I'm curious if we're going to see something like Vanguard Elite, whatever the guy that generates for Demacia, get removed for the kind of space that we would see the blocking Badger Bear. Up next, we have the Banana Blaster, and this is one that I'm kind of on edge with as just being the best card out of the new set. And it's close. We haven't gone through the whole thing yet, but I think the Banana Blaster is going to be fairly oppressive, and it's kind of on my short list of cards that'll either warp the meta and just be like just strong enough to not get nerfed or to get nerfed at some point. Just putting a single +1/+1 onto this does take it into the kind of land of bonkers, and it's just an absolute metric ton of value that you get out of playing, say, a 3/3 for 4 mana that kills off an opposing unit. And so I suspect he's going to be big. It is worth noting that that is a play ability and not like a burst speed kind of removal spell, so he is slow in that sense, but I have high expectations for the Banana Blaster. I think he's going to be a staple of the upcoming metas. Up next, we have the Priestess of Desert Light. I think this one's kind of interesting. You can see a lot of value that can get tied into this, especially if you can give it +1/+1. And so it's a 4/4 for 6, and at round start, you deal 4 to it, so it kills itself, and then you get to draw a champion. But if your deck started with 6 different champions, you get to summon it instead. And so you have to kind of stop and ask yourself, how much is this worth it? Is it worth it one time to get a free champion onto the board? Probably not. Is it worth it if you can do it twice? Probably is. And so you have to kind of ask yourself, how much of an opportunity cost is it to have a card like this come down and just fail compared to the payoff that you get when it goes right? And I feel like it's probably just a little bit too expensive. Having a basically 6 mana do nothing landmark come onto the board needs to be outright winning you the game. And this oftentimes doesn't win you the game, especially if it's like turn 7 or turn 8 of the game when you're finally getting the payoff for this, and it pulls out action, or it pulls out Azir or something. You're really looking for this to pull out the Aurelian Souls of the world, and it doesn't get to do that with enough frequency to pay off for the times where this goes wrong. Up next, we have Formula. This is the second one that I have pegged as being up in that nerf space. The Heimerdinger Jaces and the Jaces of the worlds have really started to pop off within the past week. We even started talking about looking at cards like Hidden Pathways to play with Jace. That was the 6 mana card draw card. And then we were also talking about things like what happens if, say, Portal Palooza gets nerfed up to 6 mana, and that starts to activate all of your Jace spells. And so I'm a little bit worried about Formula as Jace has really kind of started to hit his stride, and then also having this really big effect for Heimerdinger, a 6th-cost spell coming out at burst speed, letting you chain off some more spells after the fact. It does allow for some exceptionally powerful turn 8s or so with the Heimerdinger and some banked up spell mana to say, okay, here's Heimerdinger. Now I'm just gonna like get 6 cards worth of value out of 3 cards. And so I'm curious to see what Formula does. I feel like if this patch, or if the current meta had like evolved itself 2 weeks ago, Formula wouldn't exist. But as the Jace coming into play kind of effects hadn't really picked up until then, I worry about this one being a touch of a mistake. But we'll see. Time will tell how much Formula causes problems. Up next, we have Winter's Touch, and this is another interesting one to me. If memory serves, I thought Catalyst of the Aeons was a 4 mana card, and then it was deemed to be too good, and so they nerfed it up to 5. And now I'm curious if we're in the space to where something like Catalyst of the Aeons is going to get removed from the game, or if that gain 3 health is really worth that extra point of mana. And I kind of feel like this is just the space that we're about to live in. I think there's going to be probably some changes in terms of the ramp suite that's currently available in the game, and Winter's Touch could potentially have a space out here. Now, the thing that gets you kind of interested with the Winter's Touch is we do manage to play a lot of Aurelion Soul ramp in the parts of our channel, and the space that gets kind of awkward with the ramp is how your mana really flows, right? If you want to play a Catalyst of the Aeons on turn 3, you can only spend 1 mana, and then if you want to chain a Catalyst into a Catalyst, you still just have that 1 mana to play with. But if you add in the Winter's Touch, you do get to get a lot more interactivity onto the board, even if you're going for a 9 mana plan. And so you can still say, bank everything into turn 3, play the Catalyst and have a bank of 1. The next turn you have 5 crystals plus 1 mana. So you have 6 in total, and then you can Winter's Touch and then potentially put a 2-drop on the board. And so I'm curious how much that really adds in, or if they just kind of decided that, ramp isn't too powerful as is. And so I think Winter's Touch is just going to be kind of where it is in terms of the ramp for Freylord. Up next, we have the Skulking String Puller. Strikes me as garbage. So on attack, it grows your other attacking ally's power to match it. And it has the kind of perennial problem of no elusive Overwhelm or Rally. Your 6th cost units really need to be coming down and winning the game. And this guy just doesn't do it. And so, sorry, Spider. I don't think you're going to be getting the job done. Similar vein with the Serene Sky Singer. It is kind of interesting seeing this 3/6 lifesteal come down for 7 mana. There have been some metas to where that Shadow Isles dude was a relevant choice. Whatever he is, like a 6 or 7 mana, 4/7 lifesteal or something. And so just from like a stat standpoint, there has been kind of a historical relevance to abilities like this. But I think realistically, if you're playing the Sky Singer, it's for the cost reduction of the spells in your deck. And so when I'm summoned, reduce the cost of spells in your deck by half rounded up. Now, that strikes me as kind of garbage as well. I feel like as you're rolling into turn 7, turn 8, turn 9, reducing the cost of everything in your deck and still having to draw all that additional stuff just strikes me as being like way too slow to be powerful. Now, where my brain doesn't function, but I can kind of like see the potential in, is this being a summon ability. And so when I'm summoned, you reduce the cost of the spells in your deck. And so if you have some way to cheat this into play, you have the means to then have a very powerful ability going on. I can't think of anything that just cheats 7 mana units into play, but I feel like that's where the value in this is going to come in. It's not having some really expensive do-nothing unit come down and cheapen up all the spells in your deck, but finding some way to fit this into some kind of combo deck. Up next, we have the Mischievous Mirai. I don't know what to think of this one either. It seems like garbage to me, but there's probably some kind of combo potential attached to this. And so the big thing with it, when you play a spell, you summon a Powder Keg. I have to be certain that there's going to be some kind of bullshit deck that we're going to absolutely hate that's going to involve playing what's it called? The thing that copies all your created cards. And so you get to play your not your Trixie Tentacles, I'm losing it, your Otterpuss and the Otterpuss collection and generate all the pranks, and you play a bunch of pranks and do an AoE. I could most certainly see that be a thing, and we're going to absolutely hate it when that comes together. But outside of those kind of combo decks, I don't think the Mischievous Mirai is really going to have a big space in the world. And I also ask myself, if I'm chaining off 3 or 4 pranks to throw down a big spell from a Powder Keg, why am I not just playing Fleet Admiral Shelley and winning the game? And so, I can kind of see it. We can see some things happening out of that, but I'm not really impressed with the Mirai. Up next, Riven catches a slight upgrade. She doesn't have to see the Blade of the Exile, only have to create it. So you get out of these awkward spots to where you create a blade without Riven on the board, and then she never levels up. That's completely fine. I don't think this is enough to push Riven from the fringes of Constructed, but it's most certainly an upgrade. Up next, we have the Silverwing Vanguard. This is most certainly a nerf, but I get it. If you aren't familiar with what should happen with Silverwing Vanguard being a summon effect, and so it was supposed to be on summon an exact copy of me. So the second bird should come into play and then summon another bird. And so when you play the Silverwing Vanguard, it should technically summon out a full board of birds. But they had to do something with the coding so that it didn't get that. And so to come in and kind of fix that interaction, they had to switch it to a playability, which does make it, of course, weaker. But it doesn't weaken it enough to where the decks that really wanted it aren't going to want it anymore. Also, you can play it with Jin now, right? That's one of the kind of interesting side effects you see out of switching things from summon to plays is now Jin is like, ooh, the Silverwing Vanguard is just what I needed for success. But up next, we have Steam. A couple of upgrades to the Evelyn Suite. Steam strikes me as pretty interesting. And so when he's summoned, he summons a Husk. He's always done that. But when you summon a one-cost ally, you grant the strongest enemy vulnerable. And what I see a lot of with Steam now is this ability is permanent. And so you do get to kind of continually land those vulnerables out there, not have them go away. It's not a round end kind of effect, but he's also priced to the point to where other decks can be kind of interested in this. And so you could look to start playing Steam with Misfortune. You can play Steam with the Scout's Shell. There's a lot of other things that he can actually come down onto the board and be realistically useful for. And so all around, I think this is pretty great. The Evelyn interactivity suite wasn't very big, right? She was basically just limited to Hate Spike and then whatever other factions you're playing in. And so giving her access to something like Steam and now including her into something like Freylord with the Spirits Unleashed does give you a bit of opportunity to interact when you didn't previously have it. And so I think Steam does give her a bit of an edge, and it's most certainly an upgrade over the older version. In the same vein, Domination gets to move up to a 2/2, another pretty big upgrade as well. Now that she can survive a Pokey Stick and she can survive things like Vile Feast, she's just so much more resilient, much easier to put her on the board and have her sit there and be that landmark that you want to use over and over again. And so with the upgrades to both Steam and Domination, with the addition of Hate Spike in the previous patch, would not be surprised to see Evelyn spike back up into relevance, Hate Spike into relevance, if you will, and get ready to watch that animation over and over and over again. But up next, we got the Bandle Painter. He had a definite upgrade into it. A couple things going on with it. It is now in the P&Z faction, so it's a multi-faction unit to where it used to be Bandle City only. Ties in with Tristana in that sense, and now the generated follower also costs one less. And so a lot of potential to push the Bandle Painter into relevance. You have to always give a little bit of respect to these cards that let you cheat on mana. And so if we're in this kind of card generation space to where we're playing Bandle City Mayor, generating a Bandle Painter, now getting to play the Painter for 2. The Painter generates another multi-faction card, which you now get to play for -2 cost. Because of that Bandle City Mayor already on the board and the Painter's new ability. That's a pretty big collection of cheating on mana. And so I don't think that this is enough change to push one of these decks up into the forefront of the meta, but it's these small changes that really add up over the course of time and give you the potential for a really big deck. And so that Bandle City kind of card generation theme does have a lot of potential, and it's just like a card or two short of being particularly good. If you want to remember back to the days of the big value fests of playing Conchologists and Pokesticks and Bandle City Mayors and just generating card after card after card after card, the Bandle City Mayor, or the Bandle Painter, can tie into those abilities as well, and it has to be given a little bit of respect. Up next, we have Mistfall. Don't have to give this one any respect. And so when it's summoned, you draw an equipment, and then the first time each round an unequipped ally is equipped, you refill 2 spell mana. And so it is much more cheaty than it used to be. It is kind of interesting at 2 mana, but I don't feel like it's enough of a payoff to ever be relevant. This is a space to where if everything's going right and you have units on the board and you're getting Mistfall down and then you're starting to play equipments and everything, it just feels like you should have already won the game. And so I don't think this initial investment is enough. It either needs to give you like a refund right when you play it, or make it easier because you're not playing any more cards the turn you drop Mistfall. It's just too slow. Could fit into some kind of combo deck, though, right? If you have a really high value equipment and you just want to tutor for the equipment, that's the kind of space I see Mistfall being good in. Up next, we have the Wraith of Echoes. It still seems like garbage to me. I do concede that this is a fairly powerful ability, and I don't quite remember exactly how this works, right? For each ally that died this round, grant all allied copies of it. So it's giving your dead allies of the similar thing a bonus. I don't know. Whatever. You're never going to play it. This is one of these cards to where maybe it works with Legion Deserter, maybe it doesn't, but I don't think it ever has a real place in the meta. Up next, Vaults of Helya. Same kind of deal as with the Mistfall. It's just too slow. Even at 4 mana, it's just too slow. If you want the Vaults of Helya to be relevant, it needs to kill the unit as soon as you play it. Spending 4 mana on a landmark that does nothing until the next turn, and then your opponent can still interact with whatever you have on board. It just makes it a little bit too slow and too weak to actually pull off anything. Up next, we are in to the nerf section. Reveler's Feast switch from burst to focus, and it probably needed it. As a lover of the Nox and aggro, I've been having a load of fun with the Reveler's Feast over the past few patches, but I think having it be a burst spell was probably a little bit too much. Just being able to say, okay, here's my attack with 6 units, you have 3 blockers, I'm just going to Reveler's Feast, something gets blocked and hit you for an extra 6 points of burst damage. A little bit too much. But pushing it down to focus probably completely removes it from relevance. You never want to be casting Reveler's Feast before combat because your opponent knows what's coming and the unit's probably just going to die. And so it may be relevant. I think that it can't fit in decks like Pirates right now, or decks like even Tristana right now, as to where you just have a board full of generic units. I think you have to find a space with this to where you're playing Overwhelms or you're playing Elusives or something, and then it has the potential to still chunk in all of that damage, even though your units continue to get blocked. The next one, a big one, and Atrocity, moved down to slow speed, most certainly a nerf. And I'm kind of up in the air with Atrocity as to if it's even a card that should exist. And it's tough. It doesn't feel like a real overpowered and overburdened kind of card, but to a degree, it doesn't feel like a Shadow Isles card to me. And to a degree, it gives a faction a lot of power that it doesn't feel like it should have. And so I'm kind of up in the air with that, right? Having the kill your own ally to do effect thing is a very Shadow Isles thing, but having that effect be damage feels like it's kind of like a Noxus or a P&Z kind of ability. And so I'm not entirely sold on it being a Shadow Isles card. But it's most certainly been a problem since the dawn of time. It costs 6 mana at one point. People have been playing it with Commander Ladros way back in the days. Now it's finding usage with things like Tristana, and it just needs a bit of a nerf. It's too much to have this at fast speed. So when your opponent vengeances your Tristana, you're able to just Atrocity it away. Moving this to slow, most certainly a weak point. I don't play too much of the Atrocity deck, so I don't know if it's enough to be its death knell, but it is most certainly weaker now. And then last but not least, we have 2 cards left. I thought we had 1, so we said last but not least. The Wandering Shepherd, reduced to 1 health. This is a pretty significant nerf. I think the decks that want the Wandering Shepherd still want it, but it does get weakened in some other cases. And so it depends on the deck we're looking at with this, right? So if we're playing something like Pantheon Varus, we aren't looking to self-improvise. We want that target onto another unit. Same deal if we're playing Elusives, like Teemo Tristana Elusives, you want to put the equipment onto another unit. Though where this is going to hurt are the decks to where you actually weren't opposed to self-improvising. So if you're playing something like Jax, and you were wanting to have it Weapon Master on itself, now it's, of course, much worse. And so I don't think it's enough to knock it out of the format. I feel like this is the best improvised unit around right now, but I think the decks that really kind of care about this effect aren't going to be super upset about it. And last but not least, finally the last but not least, Ravoon drops from 6 health to 5, and I think I'm okay with that. His stat body was pretty enormous, but he now dies to things like Yetis and LeBlanc. That space between 5 and 6 was most certainly visible, right? The health standpoint from moving to from 3 to like 2 to 3 or 3 to 4 is completely like a different story. Like that 3 health breakpoint up into 4 is absolutely massive. Like every 3 cost unit in the game has 3 attack, and so having 4 health is absolutely monumental. But you don't see nearly as many breakpoints between 5 and 6, but there are a lot of mechanics tied into that 5 attack space between reputation and a lot of the cards in Noxus and everything, and so it's a definite important change. He's definitely weaker now, but not so much to the fact to where it's that kind of 3 to 4 change. If he was counting on his 4 health and now had 3, that would be much, much worse. And so, interesting stuff. Again, very impactful, very big changes. And the last thing I wanted to say before we got out of here is I'm curious still to where the space is going to be with competitive. And my take on this, I'm just dropping it out here because I've seen a lot of complaints on the Twitter these days in regards to the amount of high-level competitive play that's out there. And here's my take on it. Here's my stance. I feel like you have to kind of cater to the masses as you have the World of Warcraft problem, right? I've talked about the World of Warcraft problem over and over and over again. If you're not familiar with it, if you're new here, to me, the World of Warcraft problem is your game has to have absolutely everything in it. And so if you look at the World of Warcraft, what appeals to you? You like to do PvP, you like to do arena, you like to do world PvP, you like the big battleground PvP. Everything I'm saying is PvP. That's what you like to do. For me, I just like to go out and gather stuff and get some herbs and do some crafting and help funnel money into my guild with that. Guy over here really likes the quests. He's a big quest bro. He wants to know all the lore. He wants to see the world. He wants to play every class and every race so that he can get through the full lore feeling and full lore experience of the game. Now, last bro down here, he likes to do the raids and do all the dungeons. He likes a 5-man dungeon. He likes a 10-man dungeon. He likes a 10-man raid. He likes a 25-man raid. He even likes a 40-man raid. Dude loves to raid. He's having so much fun. And, that's not to say that we're not playing the same game, but everyone enjoys different aspects of it. And that's all things that are a part of the World of Warcraft now. It's been out for like almost 20 fucking years. It's all tied up into there. Now, Riot is about to release their new MMO. It's supposed to come out sometime in the near future. What does that game need to have in it? Well, for the first person, for that game to be successful, it needs to have a bunch of PvP. For me, for it to be successful, it needs to have a bunch of crafting. For that one dude over here, for it to be successful, it needs to have a very rich lore environment with a ton of quests in it. And for the last guy down the road, it needs to have a lot of raid features and a lot of high-level kind of skill-based interactions in the PvE land. None of that stuff is very the same, but if you don't have it all in your game, then someone's going to call your game a failure. And I feel like we get a lot of that into the lands of Legends of Runeterra in the sense that we're always comparing it to Magic or comparing it to Hearthstone, and as we look at Magic, they have like 10 different formats. They have Commander, they have Casual mode, they have Competitive mode, they have the Friday Night Magics, they have the Pro Tour, they have Worlds, they have Grand Prix, they have all this shit that's been built up through 30 years of existence. And then even looking over at Hearthstone, they have the various PvE modes and the PvP modes, and they have a draft mode, and they have this mode and that mode. Why can't all of that be in the Legends of Runeterra? And, I like to think that at some point it will be. At some point it will be here. But you have to really build up to all that. You have to get the player base for it to be relevant. You have to get the player base for where the time investment from the company makes it worthwhile. And that just takes time to get there. It takes time to build up to as we are approaching the 3-year anniversary of the game. I think that they've made great leaps and bounds in the sense of where it was from where it was initially released. And so I do see a lot of complaints about the very tip-top end of the competitive scene. I think it's unfortunate that 100 players or so aren't being, completely fulfilled by the game. But my kind of stance on it, my feeling on it is, if you look at something like Friday Night Magic, that's where the kind of build-up into the competitive scene starts, and that's where the biggest kind of collection of casual players is. And the kind of event and thing that appeals to a a Friday Night Magic kind of player doesn't necessarily appeal to that kind of big time tournament player, to where the reverse does kind of happen. That big time tournament player is just looking for a tournament event to play into. And I think that that's the kind of space that we're starting to see ourselves open up into. And with the release of the Daily Rumbles and the Runeterra Opens, I feel like that really kind of caters to people such as myself, as to where I have the skill and the desire to play competitively, but I don't have that skill or time commitment or really desire to try and qualify for that ultimate event like Worlds, or to fit into that space like where I'm at rank 1 on the ladder. And so I feel like, I'm probably in the majority in this one, and I feel like that's just kind of the space that Riot should be catering to. As you gotta get that build up, you have to get that kind of critical mass of players before you can have those big time events. And so my kind of grand scheme, my big thought on things and the way that things should be at the end of the world, as Boomer Bust is always right and never wrong about anything, is that I think Riot should focus on the two ends, right? I feel like that Riot should focus on the kind of casual competitive end. That's where I'm at, as to where we get to Masters very easily. We have a good time grinding in Masters, but we're not going to hit the top. If we make a good run at Seasonals, we could make a dent, but we're not going to regularly top cut a Seasonals or anything. I feel like that's where the majority of the player base is. And I think Riot should also cater to that very top end with Worlds, as to where they should be putting together the framework to draw people in and build them towards that gigantic landmark of being, hey, I'm the best one in the world. This is our premier event. Now, what I think that the middle space is being, kind of left out for these competitive people is what would be kind of like a pro tour. And I don't feel like that's, really Riot's space to be dealing with. I feel like as they're adding in, more features and more things kind of relevantly, it's up to someone else to kind of bear the torch there and carry that on. I feel like as you're looking at things like the Star City events and Magic, that's the kind of space that you have to look for someone else to kind of pick up the slack with and really develop that big kind of competitive scene. And so I can go ahead and tell you now, the downside for these people is that there's only like 100 of them. There's a vocal proponent of the community that is really looking towards this kind of thing, and I can tell you, with there only being 100 people or so like that, that Pro Tour event is never going to come out. And so I think that kind of doubly ties in to the focus that Riot should be doing on the mass majority of people, funneling them into the competitive scene at the casual competitive end, and then having that one big top end event that gets the views on the Twitch and the views on the gaming news sites of the world, because you have some kind of 100K payout event out there. So, just my take, my rambly thought on the state of the top level of competitive. I think that if you want that kind of pro toury kind of space, that competitive land that isn't Worlds, you need that grassroots effort to really come in and build that out. But nonetheless, that is going to do it for us today. So, agree or disagree with any of my nonsense and ramblings, be sure to leave a comment. I love to hear it, because that is going to do it for us today. And so I hope everyone enjoyed the video. Hope you maybe learned a thing or two along the way. Had a good time watching. So this is Busted Me. Thank you for being here.